Hello everyone, Dicko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. Today I'm going to show you how you can achieve the animation style featured in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse in a matter of minutes. Now when you watch an animated film like Into the Spider-Verse, it's understandable that you might think that most of the techniques used in the film require a ridiculous amount of money and research into achieving that particular look. And whilst that is certainly true for much of the film, if you strip back the colours, the toon lines, and the crazy motion, the fundamental techniques of animation used with regards to the characters are very traditional in nature. For the most part, much of what people love about the film is down to the art direction and the very deliberate choices that come with making a film that's now become iconic. In this walkthrough, we'll cover a single piece of that art direction puzzle, which is how the characters are animated. Now, if you're wondering how to achieve the look of Spider-Verse, but really mean the shading style, then this tutorial isn't for you. This one's for the animators out there. Now this method is probably most effective when you're wanting to make a short animation or a short film. I'm sure that the people at Sony ImageWorks had a more robust method than this, but again, as a cheap trick, this is definitely one that gives you bang for the buck, which by the way is $0. So all the bang for you. This method is also software agnostic, so if you're trying to use something else other than Blender, this will work just as well. So let's quickly break down a clip from Spider-Verse. As you can see, Miles is keyframed on every second frame, whilst the camera and the objects he interacts with are animated on every single frame. In other words, Miles is animated on 2s, whilst the things around him are animated on 1s. This becomes even more complicated when some of the other characters he interacts with are also animated on 1s. See what I'm saying about that crazy as fuck art direction? So how can we achieve this effectively? Well, let's find out. I'm going to start with something simple. Here I have two identical ball rigs. I'll quickly keyframe the same movement on both rigs, then demonstrate how to convert one of them to animate on 2s. Alright, so I've finished up a quick little animation. Both balls are literally identical in terms of their animation. They have the same keyframes, the same movement. I'll just quickly play it back and show you how it looks. So yeah, pretty simple. Got a bit of a smear, just a bit more fun that way. And yeah, as you can see, they're identical, every single sense of the way. And if I click on the control rigs, so I'll just pause that for a second, you'll see the keyframes on the timeline. Now, as you can see, not every keyframe or not every frame has a keyframe on it, but it's enough for the software to interpolate that movement pretty smoothly. So essentially it's animating on 1s. So it's rendering every frame from 0 to 50 with movement. So the next stage is to convert this into 2s. And that's pretty simple to do. So the first thing we need to do is bake out these keyframes so there is actually a keyframe on every second frame of our timeline. And to do that, it's pretty straightforward. All we got to do is, with the rig selected or the control selected or the object that's been animated selected, and go up to Pose, Animation, Bake Action. So in other software they may be just called Bake Animation, but in Blender it's called Bake Action. So just click on Bake Action and you'll get a little pop-up. And on this pop-up you'll see a few options. And the most important one is the frame step. So what this is going to do, as it is by default, is add a keyframe on every frame between 1 and 50. What we want is to keyframe every second frame. So we just have to switch that to 2. We'll keep the bake data applied to the pose, not the object. And we'll set it to only selected bones. So all the other defaults are fine. We press OK, and as you can see, where there is animation that has a notable difference in the pose, it's added a keyframe on every second frame. So let's just zoom into the timeline and have a look there. So frame 1 has a frame, frame 2 no keyframe. Frame 3, there's a keyframe, which is exactly what we want. As you can see, if I select my other rig I'll just switch out and then back into my other rig. You'll see that this one has my original keyframes, but they're moving identically. The timing is is identical. Alright, so let's just pop back into my other rig. Select the control. And now there's only one more step we need to do really, and that is to convert this these keyframes from a spline into stepped, or in the case of Blender, it's called constant. So I'll just pop open my graph editor just to show you how that looks at the moment. If I open up the graph editor and look at the keyframes, you'll see that the interpolation is still pretty smooth. Now, what we got to do now is convert this to stepped. And that's pretty simple. We can either select all the keyframes in the graph editor, or we can just select them all in the timeline. I'm just going to do it in the timeline. Select all those keyframes, and then push T on the keyboard, and you'll get a dialog box that pops up asking to switch it to whatever interpolation you like. So by default, it's just set to Bezier, but we need to switch it to constant. And look what happens to the graph up here when I switch it to constant. So select it all, press T, and then select constant on the pop-up. You'll see that the graph has changed drastically. It looks like a little bit of a step ladder or a step. Now if I play that back, you'll see it suddenly looks like cell animation, like traditional animation. The timing is exactly the same as the bottom ball, but because we're holding on every second frame, it gives the illusion of being animated on twos. Now, let's just have a look at how this looks frame by frame. So on the first frame, we're at a 0 point. If I switch over to frame 2, you'll see that in the automatic interpolation, the ball is already moving. It's already starting to spline into the next pose. Whereas with my baked out animation with it set onto constant or stepped, it hasn't moved at all. But if I switch over to frame 3, it's now taking on the exact same pose as the ball underneath it. It's effectively playing catch up with the original animation. And that's basically the gist of it. But we can take it to another level with another animation. Alright, so I've got a character here now. Let's see how this method works with an actual character. Now, granted, this isn't the best looking character, but it will serve our purposes really well because it's really easy to read. And it will play back in real time, which is great. So I won't have to do any play blasts or anything like that. Alright, so basically this character is just doing a punch. So as you can see, just a traditional basic looking sort of animation, nothing fancy. I only spent about an hour and a half working on it. I only had that much time during lunch to do it. So same method as before basically. We just select every joint or every control that we have animation on it, and then bake that out onto twos, and then we convert those keyframes that are animated on twos into a stepped version of that, or rather a constant version of that if you're using Blender. Alright, I'm just going to pause that for a second. Now, sometimes when you do this, obviously, if you're still working on this animation and then you want to preview sort of the look in twos, you want to have a way of preserving your original animation. So when we bake the animation this time, we're going to turn on an extra function with this animation. So everything's selected. We'll just double check. So double tap, I'm going to tap A, make sure everything's selected, select all of my keyframes, and then I'm going to go to pose, animation, bake action. I'm going to set my frame step to 2 again, but this time I'm going to make sure that I don't have overwrite current action enabled. So basically what this is going to do is create a new set of animation data. In Blender, these are called actions. So it's going to create a new action, and if you ever have to go back to your original animation, you'll still have that action available in your library, basically in your scene data of the animation. So just make sure that's checked off when you do this bake, if you are doing work in progress sort of animation. So I'm just going to push OK, and again, keyframes on every second frame. I'm going to interpolate that as a constant, and then let's play that back. As you can see, the frames are now set to a stepped pattern, and now if I play that back, we're getting that sort of 2D sort of effect, that cell animation sort of style of animation going on. But there's one thing that I want to do that will make this look even better, and that's combining that sort of that animation on twos sort of style with animation on ones. And this happens all the time in traditional animation. It's particularly in times where a character builds up a lot of energy and then has to exert that to great effect. So in this instance, I have the character building up to a punch, and then he takes 2 frames to get from this pose to his outer pose with the punch, and then another 2 frames to get to the fullest extent of his punch, and then he starts settling, right? So rather than taking all this time to get from there to there, I'm going to compress these groups of frames here from 21 to 25 into a series of ones that follow one of each other. So basically it will make the punch feel a lot more weighty, and I have a lot more energy. So again, I'm going to select all of my controls that I have keyframes on, and then I'm just going to move this keyframe up 1 frame to there, and again I'm going to move the next one up 2 frames, so we get that super smooth punch out of that. And then as you can see, we have this massive gap, a massive hold now, where I've moved all the keyframes. So to fix that, I'm just going to move this frame on 25 a couple frames backwards as well. So effectively what we're going to get is animation on 2s on the build up, animation on 1s at the punch, and then animation on 3s on the settle. So I'm going to move that across so it sits dead center in between our punch and our settle at the end. So let's play this back now and see how that feels. Huh. Look at that. Suddenly, not only is this more powerful, the punch is more powerful, it has energy, it also gives us time to register that punch when he settles. And this is a very traditional way of animating. This is something that has happened since the dawn of animation, basically. The idea that we utilize frames, we utilize animation on 1s when it's absolutely necessary. And the reason why they would think about it in that way is simply because you want to save your resources on animation that matters the most. And that's usually high energy animation, or animation that requires some really strong sense of movement. So animators in the past would dedicate animating on 1s to very specific points in animation, and then save the time elsewhere by animating on 2s. And then when you really need to slow down your animation, like really subtle animation, you would animate that on 3s. So basically you'd have 3 frames per between each pose or each point of motion. So this is already really effective. We're getting that sort of Spider-Verse sort of feel in a single character. And you'll see that this happens all the time in Spider-Verse, especially with Miles, where he goes from animating on 2s to 1s to 3s, depending on the nature of his motion, his action, and his behavior. So for instance, when he's graceful and swift and he's skillful, he'll be animated almost entirely on ones. But when he becomes clumsy or self-conscious or makes mistakes, he will suddenly switch from ones to twos because of the art direction. Basically, the art direction demanded that when Miles wasn't at his peak, he would be basically animating in a rougher, he'd be actually look rougher in his animation. Now, as you can see, we got a pretty good result out of this single character, but how about we combine two characters and a camera movement to get that final sort of Spider-Verse feel where the characters are moving at twos or ones and the camera is still moving at ones. So we get a smooth camera, we get animation on twos, and then we get hard action on ones. Alright, so here's our final animation. Now we have two characters, we have a camera, and we have a lot of action going on, which you will see in a second. So let me just play that back. Boom. So as you can see, there's this big, slow, lumbering character that takes a lot of energy to lift that hammer and smash it down on the ground with a lot of force. We have the camera reacting to that force and then rotating and panning to match the movement of our little blue character who's trying to escape and then fight the big guy. And she's moving pretty quickly as well. So there's a multitude of ways we can approach this in terms of giving it that sort of stepped feel. I personally am going to go with the big character taking on most of that sort of stepped animation. I might be able to add some of that effect to the small blue character as well, probably toward the end when she settles. So she can probably slow down in terms of like smoothness of animation there. I'll quickly just put that together and then you'll see what the difference is. So as you can see, it's all pretty smooth right now. I mean, there's still some weight and there's still some heft in bringing that hammer up and then smashing it down, but it's all pretty smooth. So I'll just quickly go ahead and change it to how I think it should feel, and we'll break it down after that. Alright, so let's just break down what I've done so far. So the big guy is largely animated on twos, and so is his hammer. But when he goes in for he gets to his maximum energy level, which is around here before he hits the hammer down, he's on threes to settle. Not to settle, but sort of like build up that energy and get that pose read in. And then when he hits play on that hammer hit, it's 1, 2, and he's down. So if I play that back, whoo. Let's play that back again. 1, whoo. And again, what I've done here, when he starts to swing back up, I've actually removed keyframes here. I've actually decided that maybe at the start of that swing, it should be being held on threes. So that gives it a bit more time for him to sort of build up that energy before he comes in for the upswing again, which leads into some ones. So right there, very quick motion. And then he settles back down into some threes and twos. And as you can see, it feels very weighty. And when he brings it down, brings that hammer down, you can feel the impact of that hammer. Now, for the other character, I've kind of done something a bit interesting. So, while I have moved some of the keyframes to keep in with that movement, it's still in stepped. And especially here, it's all on twos and in stepped all the way to the end of the animation. But I've combined the stepped interpolation with the automatic spline interpolation to get that smooth movement from that jump. So that graceful movement, if you want to call it that still feels smooth. But then when she hits that impact on that first stone or that first cube, it jumps back into twos because all that energy has been exerted on that first jump. And now she's just keeping up with that momentum as she runs to each block. And the camera itself is just as it was before. Still smooth, still automatic interpolation. And that's pretty much the gist of this method. It's about combining different interpolations, and it's about choosing when those moments happen, those moments of increased energy and those moments of reduced energy in the form of reduced frames, basically, and in a reduced frame rate. When you have less energy, you reduce the frame rate of those characters, or the amount of keyframes per, the stepped nature of it. And when you have high energy, you bring back that frame rate to a smoother or a more graceful looking animation. Now, that being said, go ahead and give it a go. And when you show it to your mates, they'll just say, "Oh, you just copied Spider-Verse. You just copied Spider-Verse." Well, you can just tell them that no, Spider-Verse copied the last 100 years of animation. Catches.